thanks for coming out tonight, particularly considering the weather. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to see you here. Well, tonight's talk is about why Christmas is celebrated on December 25th. And it's a talk that I've put together through my own research, my own readings and learning, education, as well as the scholarship of a few other people, particularly Andrew McGowan, who's the dean and president of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. Some of his theories are presented in here, so I just want to give credit where credit is due. And I happen to go along with these theories. And so, to start, the question of why December 25th is puzzling if you think about it, because if you read the Gospels, if you read the Bible, there's no mention of this date in the Bible. There's no mention of it in the Acts of the Apostles. There's no mention of it in the epistles. And there's really no mention of it during the first couple of centuries of Christian history. It's just not, it doesn't appear. So the earliest reference to a date for Christmas comes from Clement of Alexandria. He was a church father, a bishop, a writer, around the beginning of the 3rd century, 200 AD or CE as academics call it now. And he suggested various dates. And these dates kind of make sense in a way. They're all springtime, warm month dates. And that timing makes sense when you think about the shepherds tending their flocks, right? Which, as is mentioned in the book of Luke, chapter 2, verse 8. That suggests a springtime environment of the lambing season, when the lambs are born then, because that'll give them plenty of time to grow their wool to get through the winter that's coming several months away. So by the 4th century, there are references to 2 dates, December 25th in the West and January 6th in the East, which is known in the West as the Feast of the Epiphany. In between December 25th and January 6th is this period of 12 days, or the 12 days of Christmas. So, by the 4th century, a midwinter date was settled upon. Now, why? Why midwinter? Going from the Luke reference about the springtime and the lambs and the warm weather, how did it get to be December 25th? Well, there's several theories. One is kind of popular, and the other is maybe not so well known. The most popular one is that the date was borrowed from the Roman midwinter festival of Saturnalia. This is a festival in honor of the god of agriculture. And around 270 AD, the Emperor Aurelian also established December 25th as the day to celebrate the feast of Sol Invictus. Sol, S-O-L, meaning the sun. Invictus, unconquered. So the unconquered sun. Now, to understand why he did that and why that day was special, I'm going to take a very brief detour to talk a little bit about the 7-day week, how that happened to come about. The concept of the 7-day week dates to antiquity, when Babylonian astronomers and Egyptian astrologists assigned particular days to certain heavenly bodies, namely Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. The Jews as well operated on a 7-day week based on the creation narrative in Genesis, in which God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Now, the Romans adopted this 7-day week from the Egyptians during the 1st and 2nd centuries, and the day of the sun became dies solis, later Germanicized in Roman Gaul, and the Romans were up in Gaul, as this word. So in Roman Gallic, that day is Sonntag. What does that sound like? Sunday, right? So it became in English Sunday. Now, going a step further, as they usually did, the Romans did, when they often absorbed the traditions of other cultures and client kingdoms and whatnot, the Romans customized this basic concept of Sunday to suit their own religious preferences. So Sunday became this day of Sol Invictus, the undefeated sun. And it had a cult of its own, favored at various times by various emperors. And among them was Aurelian, who I said in 270 introduced this worship of Sol Invictus as an official religion. You know, just one of the official gods that you worshipped in Roman culture. The date that Aurelian chose to dedicate the temple to the sun god was familiar to pagans as the occasion of the sun's midwinter rebirth, when the longer daylight hours began to gradually return, and we're all looking forward to that, I know. And that date was December 25th. And that was the date that the emperor chose to dedicate this temple. And of course, to later Christians, that date became familiar as the date of Jesus' birth. Jesus, by the way, was associated with this day. These are two illustrations. This is Sol Invictus on the left here, the god that I've been talking about. But on the right, this is a very early representation of Christ, 3rd century, from St. Peter's, from down in they found this in the bowels of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And I think you can see very close similarities here. This is Jesus, his beardless youth with a kind of halo, a nimbus, a radius around his head, you know, riding this chariot. So this is the association. You can see it's beginning to merge here. So December 25th is this familiar Roman sacred day. The idea of the early church missions to celebrate holidays at the same time was to induct pagans so they could make this transition. They'd be more open to Christianity. So if you go around and you're trying to convince people to follow your religion, you might want to say, look, this is kind of like yours. Look, we have some of the same days. We can use some of the same concepts and whatnot, some of the same mystical ideas. And so that's what was going on. And this is a quote here from a letter of Pope Gregory the Great when he sent Augustine, St. Augustine, who became very associated with Canterbury and founded an abbey there and whatnot. You know, he told him, look, you know, go out there, familiarize yourself with what's going on. Don't tear down their temples and whatnot, but let's rededicate them. Let's use them. I mean, that was for a couple of reasons. It was to induce people to, you know, to have that familiarity work for them. All right, it's now no longer a pagan temple. Now it's a church. It'll work that way. But also, buildings, you know, particularly stone buildings, were expensive and hard to build. And, you know, why waste a good building? Right? I mean, there's no sense in tearing it down. It's already there. Why not use it again? And a good example of just that is what happens to be the oldest parish in England, St. Martin's, which is in Kent. This is the private chapel of Queen Bertha of Kent, who was around in the 6th century, actually before Augustine showed up. She was a Christian Frankish princess who arrived in England with her chaplain, and she married King Ethelbert of Kent. And her husband, he was a pagan, but he allowed her to continue to practice her religion. And in this church that he had built for her, and it was built, though, on the foundations of an existing Roman temple. I used to live in Kent for a little while, and not too far from this church. And I used to love to go in and look at it. And right up in the sanctuary there, in this, right here in this part, if you look at that, you'll see the foundations of the temple, and there's this brickwork in there, and it dates to pagan Roman times. It's really quite impressive. Now, it's true that some elements of Christmas do resemble pagan customs, like the Christmas tree, which is actually traced to Druidic origins. Also, the mistletoe. You know, Druids believed And Druids were the Celtic priestly class. The Druids believed that the mistletoe was a plant that fell to earth from heaven. So it's a joining of heaven and earth, a kind of reconciliation, if you will, between two opposing forces. And as such, it came to symbolize a gesture of trust and goodwill between enemies, and eventually a gesture of proposal between a man and a woman. Oh, and of course, nowadays it's just a good place to get a cheap thrill after a few eggnogs, right, at the office Christmas party by grabbing a kiss under the mistletoe. But that's its origin. So that is a pagan tradition that has now come to be very closely associated with Christmas, of course. So all these theories here about the adoption of a Roman pagan holiday to attract and assure pagan converts of Christianity's validity and importance, and to help it blend in, these all make a lot of sense. But there's still problems with these theories. There's that nagging question of why is this date, December 25th, why is it not mentioned in the earliest Christian writings? And also, early Christians would only go so far in adapting pagan customs. So it's unlikely that they would choose Saturnalia, which was this favored holiday of a pagan Roman emperor, to use as the birth date of the central character in the story of Christianity. So, how do we account for December 25th as the date of the birth? Well, the answer may not lie so much in the date of Jesus' nativity, but in the date of his death. According to the Gospel of John, Christ died as the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. This would have taken place on the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is March and April in the Jewish calendar. The Jews used a lunar calendar, and they had different names for the months. So in about the year 200, a church father by the name of Tertullian, very active, very prolific guy, working backwards through the emperors and their reigns, which is often how people calculated things back then, he figured that the 14th day of Nisan, this day of Christ's death, in the year that Jesus died, would have been March 25th in the Roman calendar. March 25th was later recognized as the Feast of the Annunciation because it fell in the spring. It was a time of renewal. And it was also one of the four calendric dates that divided the years into quarters, kind of like fiscal quarters. So Jesus was conceived and crucified on the same day, on the same calendric date, March 25th. Okay, so do the math and go 9 months from March 25th, and you have December 25th, 9 months. So that's one theory of how December 25th was chosen, because of this date. Now, according to the Julian calendar, March 25th was the spring equinox, and for pagans, this was the anniversary of the creation of the world. And that date for Jesus' birth appealed to many Christians because Paul identified Christ as the new Adam. And this tradition, mentioned by the 5th century writer Augustine — this is a different Augustine, this is Augustine of North Africa, not the one who was at Canterbury — he wrote about this as well. The Eastern Church recognized this, but instead of the 14th of Nisan, they calculated the 14th of their first spring month using this ancient Greek calendar that they used, which begins not in January, but at the first full moon after the summer solstice, and that corresponds to April 6th in our calendar. So the 9 months difference there makes it January 6th, which is why January 6th is in some Eastern Christian churches is actually Christmas date, is January 6th. So we're going to do a little bit more. I'll talk a little bit more about calendars in just a sec. But this idea of Christ's birth and death being bound together by the same date reflects ancient and medieval understandings of salvation being bound together. And you can see this in some art. This is a medieval Flemish, I believe, piece of art here showing the Annunciation. And you can see up in the left-hand corner there's God the Father sending Jesus, but what is he doing? He's the baby Jesus, but he's bearing this cross. So Jesus' birth is closely tied up in the Christian imagination with his death. They are linked in this way. And this idea of important things happening on the same date is actually rooted in Judaism. Jewish tradition taught that great figures like Moses were born and died on the same calendar day. Nisan is a very important month in the Jewish religion and Jewish customs. There are important reminders found in the Talmud that discuss this. The world being created in Nisan, Isaac being born in Nisan, and so great things happen on the same dates. And this would have been something that the earliest Christians, who were Jews, they would have picked up on. They would have recognized this. It would have made sense to them. So there's the date. But how about the year? Can we come up with a year? Well, actually, Jesus was probably born in 5 BC, 5 years before he was born. Now, how could that be? Well, let's take a look at this AD and BC business here. And I hope you can see this, but I'm going to draw a little timeline here for you. Okay. So here's BC, AD. All right, everybody get that? So early Christians used the Julian calendar. It was the old Roman calendar, which was based, it went back centuries before Julius Caesar eventually changed it. But in 525 CE or AD, a Syrian monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus was called upon to cleanse the Roman calendar, the old Roman calendar, of all these pagan feast dates and whatnot, and come up with a cycle for the date of Easter that would be universal in the church. Universality was really important in the early church. Everybody had to agree. Everybody had to sing off the same page, or else it was all going to go off kilter, and there'd be heresies and there'd be disagreements, and well, that's kind of what happened anyway. But anyway, it was important for the early Christians to figure out what date is Easter and what's it going to be. And the Nicene Creed is another thing. The wording of that was very important. So Dionysius also reinforced this March 25th date for the Annunciation by making March 25th the beginning of the new year, just as the conception of Jesus in Mary's womb was a new beginning for the new world. So he decided to date the new calendar from the birth of Christ using this Roman method that I told you Tertullian used, of dating events by calculating the years and reigns of emperors and Roman consuls. But he committed 2 important mistakes. The first is that he forgot in his calendar here, he forgot to include the year 0. Because, well, I mean, you can forgive the old boy, because actually in the Roman numerals had no 0. The concept of 0 didn't really enter the Western imagination until the Middle Ages, because it has its genesis in India, in the subcontinent of India, and then it was passed to the West via Arab and Muslim intellectuals and mathematicians and scientists and whatnot, and that's how it ended up in Europe. So, so he forgot 0. And this was important, of course, because in the same way, because there had to be a year here, right? Like here's the year 1, but there were 12 months here. There was time. So it's the same way that we didn't go from 1999 to 2001, right? We had the year 2000. Well, it's the same thing. So he overlooked that. Okay, so now we've lost a year. So Jesus is no longer born right here. He's actually, all right, now we're down 1 year. Back that way. The next mistake that he made, for whatever reason, he didn't include the first 4 years of Augustus's reign as emperor. Augustus was after Julius Caesar, and Augustus didn't call himself Augustus for the first 4 years. He went by his given name, which was Octavian. And so if you miss those additional 4 years in his calculations, all of a sudden you're down here to 5 BC, which we now think of as that dividing line between BC and AD. So we have Dionysius to thank for that. Now, some scholars believe that Jesus may have been born even earlier, some maybe 6 or 7 BC. Well, how could that be? The death of Herod provides a clue. According to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was born around the time of Jesus' death, Herod died in 4 BC. Now, how do we know that? Well, because Josephus records that Herod died after a lunar eclipse and before Passover. Well, astronomers who know how to calculate these things have determined that the only lunar eclipse that would have occurred at this time and was visible in Jerusalem happened in 4 BC. So Herod, as we know, ordered the slaying of the children of Bethlehem. And that the Greek word that's used in the Gospels it's not the babies. He didn't go kill the babies. He told them to go kill what is in Greek, pais. And that means a toddler. That means someone who's not yet schooled. So really, a little, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, little just toddling infant. So, by 4 BC, Jesus was maybe already a toddler, which meant, now if you take into consideration these years that Dionysius missed, then you're back maybe to 7 BC, perhaps, for Jesus' birth. But the accepted date among many scholars is 5 BC. So, Christmas, if you look at Clement of Alexandria, maybe April, May, March, or maybe December of 4, 5, 6 BC. What does it matter? Well, I don't know. It's just, think of it this way. If you want to go into human resources and ask for Christmas Day off, you've got a whole bunch of them to say, well, hey, look, history tells me these dates. But anyway, all right. Well, that's some history, and I'd just like to go through a bit of Christmas traditions as well. Even though Christianity tried to distance itself from its pagan past, some elements crept in. One is the Yule, or the Yule log. This is a word and custom that actually has pagan roots, old Nordic roots. The Yule, it was a festival, a wintertime festival. The word was Yule, right, from where we get Yule. It's also where you get the word jolly, comes from Yule. It was a Scandinavian midwinter festival, and it ran from December 21st into January. And what they did was they would just put this big old log in the fire, and this enormous thing, and basically just drink until it was gone. And usually 12 days. And but actually that's an important point. This whole business of merrymaking that suffuses Christmas has really more pagan origins. Late winter, early fall, this is the time when you'd slaughter animals that aren't going to make it through the winter, so you have a lot of meat on hand. You also had wine and beer that you made earlier in the year, and that's starting to get ready to drink. It's starting to get nice and ripe and ready. And during the Middle Ages and on through the 19th century, this was also a time for the poor to go cruising from home to home. asking for food and drink, demanding in some cases, especially a cup or two of wassail, and that's spiced ale or wine. And wassail is a saying that actually just means good health. And so they would go, the poor would go from place to place, maybe singing a song, which is how you now have caroling. People come to your house and sing carols. Well, that's really the origins of that kind of sort of rowdy, almost like a Halloween kind of tradition, if you will. Now, Cromwell and his bunch, the Puritans, actually outlawed Christmas in England because it was associated with all this drinking and rowdiness and demanding things from people. And so under Charles II, during the Restoration period, Christmas was restored along with, Christmas was restored as well in England. But in Puritan America, which was trying to distance itself from England, right, separate itself, there was no Christmas. It was actually outlawed by the Puritans. They looked down on it. So Christmas really wasn't celebrated here in America for the first, well, at least the first couple of centuries of what we would call American history, because it was so associated with rowdiness. Actually, the New York police force, believe it or not, was actually formed in response to a Christmas riot of 1828. And it wasn't declared a federal holiday, an official holiday, until 1870. Now, because of this rowdiness, there was a movement among New York's upper classes to make it the kind of home for the holidays event that we now know. There were stories and poems and basically marketing. Among one of the guys that actually helped out here was the American writer Washington Irving. You know him as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, but he wrote a book, the book that those stories were contained in, called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, gentleman. Geoffrey Crayon was kind of an upper middle class guy who went around and visited various places and reported on them. There's a fictional character that Irving created. And it features a story about Crayon visiting an English country manor at Christmas time and learning about their traditions. And while he was there, he talked to the local squire. And the local squire, I'm quoting from this story now. This is the squire talking. "The nation is altered. We've almost lost our simple, true-hearted peasantry. They've broken asunder from the higher classes and seem to think their interests are separate. They have become too knowing and begin to read newspapers, listen to alehouse politicians, and talk of reform. I think one mode to keep them in good humor in these hard times would be for the nobility and gentry to pass more time on their estates, mingle more among the country people, and set the merry old English games going again." So this is the upper classes' reaction to the lower classes getting a bit rowdy, kind of, daring to learn how to read. And he thinks that the squire thinks that they should be put back in their place a bit. So Crayon, picking up on this squire's observations, told him or he reported, such was the good squire's project for mitigating public discontent. And indeed, he had once attempted to put his doctrine to practice, and a few years before had kept open house during the holidays in the old style. The country people, however, did not understand how to play their parts in the scene of hospitality. Many uncouth circumstances occurred. The manor was overrun by all the vagrants of the country, and more beggars drawn into the neighborhood in 1 week than the parish officers could get rid of in a year. Since then, he had contented himself with inviting the decent part of the neighboring peasantry to call at the hall on Christmas Day, and with distributing beef and bread and ale among the poor, that they might go, make merry on their own. Just don't come here. We'll come to you. So it was kind of a disaster. He invited in all these ragamuffin people, and they no doubt trashed the place, and as they would be expected to. So Irving wrote about all this stuff, and someone who read Irving and admired Irving was Charles Dickens. And Dickens's Christmas Carol was inspired by the writings of Washington Irving. Washington Irving writing about Christmas in merry old England. So this classic, quintessential Christmas story that we come to think of as being the old English Christmas, we actually have an American writer to thank for kind of planting that seed in the mind of English writer Charles Dickens. The Christmas tree actually has it's a long-standing pagan tradition. It was the idea of bringing in something green from the outside in the middle of winter to remind you that spring is going to come. Winter can't defeat us. The Egyptians, long ago it was Egyptian times, they would bring palms into their homes to symbolize the triumph of Ra or life over death. And people would put evergreens in their homes and whatnot. Now, Martin Luther, the founder of the Reformation, was credited with erecting the first Christmas tree. According to the legend, he was on his way home one winter night and was struck by the beauty of the twinkling stars among the fir trees and decided to show his family by recreating it in the house. Right? And I can just imagine his wife's reaction, right? I mean, you're bringing this tree in the house. It's not good enough for you that you've been excommunicated. Now you got to bring a tree in the house. But in any event, Luther is credited with introducing the Christmas tree. It's a nice story, probably not true, but it's actually more likely that the tree, this decorated tree that we have, originated in the medieval morality plays. These were kind of shows that help people understand theological ideas and concepts during the Middle Ages in the public square. And one that was held on the Feast of Adam and Eve, December 24th, had this tree called the Paradise Tree, which was hung with apples or things that looked like apples. So that is probably the inspiration for the Christmas ornaments, this medieval morality play. And it's actually a representation of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is also the root of the Christmas pageant, which kind of shoves together all the details into one story. And I've spelled out here, you can see that there are actually two different stories in the Gospels about the birth of Jesus, and they don't exactly conflict, but they don't all add up. So in one there are wise men, and in another there's not wise men, in one there's shepherds, in other ones there's no shepherds, in one it's in a house, the other it's in a stable. So what actually Francis of Assisi did in the Middle Ages was kind of being inspired by these morality plays, he decided to stage a nativity scene, a live nativity scene in the church. And that is what really was the origin of our Christmas pageant today. Another little sidebar here on the Christmas pageant cast of characters that's been subject to a bit of spin over the centuries is the identity and role of St. Joseph. And the Gospel of Luke tells us that Mary was espoused to a man named Joseph. And that word espoused is not the same as engaged. Espousal was a declaration of marriage by wedding vows, but not the marriage ceremony itself. What would happen is you'd get espoused, which is essentially you'd get married, but you'd wait a year to move in together. Typically it was a year. So during that period, the couple was considered, though, married in the eyes of God and in the community, and then after the year they'd have their wedding and the bride would move in with her husband. So this scandal of Mary becoming pregnant during this time when she was espoused to Joseph is that she was married. They were married. And they weren't living together. So if they're not living together and they're married and she's pregnant, well, that's a problem, right? So, of course, in the Gospels, Joseph is told in a dream that Mary would give birth to the Messiah, and so he did the right thing and he stands by her. But another clarification I'd like to point out is Joseph's age. He's often depicted, as you see here on the right, as this old man. But again, Jewish custom at the time was that men would marry by the age of 16 or so. Certainly if you were 24 and you were a man, you'd be the equivalent of an old maid, basically. So Joseph was probably about the same age as Mary, who was 14 or 15 when she gave birth to Jesus. And some of the earliest depictions of Joseph, such as this 4th century image on the left, it's a fresco from the catacombs of San Gennaro in Naples, they show Joseph to be about the right age. He was probably 16, 17, maybe 18, maybe a little older. So why was it important? Why do all these artists depict Joseph as an old man? Well, around the 4th century, there began to be some debate about the perpetual virginity of Mary. And by way, there was an implication that maybe Joseph was the father of this child, really. So this was a problem. It was heresy. It could cause people to go off track in their thinking. And so the church fathers and the artists began to depict Joseph not as a young man, but as an old man, a really old man, a man who couldn't possibly have been the father of the child, just beyond his years. So, and that's actually a trend that continued into the 20th century. Still today, you often see pictures of Joseph as an old dude. Returning to wrap up really to a few more traditions, the tree, as we know it now today, was popularized by Victoria and Albert, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in England, in the 1840s. The picture that you see on the left is from the London Illustrated News, 1848. There you see Albert and Victoria and the children with the tree there in the royal palace. And it may have been because Victoria's mother was German and that Martin Luther influence came into play there. And so the royals in England established the tree there around with Victoria. Now, of course, you know, whenever the royals did something, it becomes trendy, faddish, right? So in America, they picked up on it. And the picture on the right is from an American magazine around the same time, maybe a little bit later. And I don't know if my cursor will work here on this. Does that work? Yeah, there we go. So if you look, there's Victoria with a crown. And what the Illustrated did was they just took the crown away there. And then Albert's got a little mustache, his telltale mustache. Well, that's gone. And the sash is removed, and that's gone. So that's all they did, was they just changed it. In 1822, Clement Clark Moore wrote and published his classic Night Before Christmas. Moore was an Episcopal minister and a professor of Oriental and Greek literature at Columbia. He was a biblical scholar. And despite his association with this warm, cheery Christmas poem, Moore himself was actually not such a nice guy. He really wasn't such a humanitarian. I mean, he opposed the abolition of slavery. He opposed developments of homes for the working class in New York. He didn't want his taxes going to pay for things like sidewalks. But he developed and sold property there in New York for his rich friends, which became Chelsea. And there's even some debate over whether or not he actually wrote this thing. I'm sure that he's spinning in his grave, being this biblical scholar, this big-time Columbia professor, and this is all he's remembered for, is this poem. Now, the poem, which he was actually initially hesitant to publish because it was such a silly little thing, is largely responsible for our modern image of Santa Claus as the right jolly old elf. With this portly figure and a supernatural ability to ascend a chimney with a nod of his head. Moore took a bunch of traditions from European legends of Christmas. The gift giving is from the Dutch St. Nicholas. The Norse god Thor's sleigh was pulled by goats, but Moore changed them to reindeer. The chimney descent coming down the chimney was from a mythical visitor at Christmas time in German tradition and French and Italian practice of hanging the stockings. He took all these things and he put them there together in this poem. And the name was actually, Santa Claus's name, was an Americanization of the Dutch Sinterklaas. So nonetheless, Moore's poem really helped to popularize Christmas and his account of a visit from St. Nicholas really created this popular icon that we know today. In 1881, the political cartoonist Thomas Nast drew on Moore's poem to create the first likeness that matches our modern image of Santa Claus. So his cartoon, which appeared in the Harper's Weekly, depicted Santa as a rotund, cheerful man with a full white beard holding a sack with toys. And it was Nast, actually, who gave Santa the bright red suit with the white fur. Nast, relocated him to the North Pole and gave him a workshop up there. Came up with the elves and came up with a wife, Mrs. Claus. It was Thomas Nast who created that. Coca-Cola is commonly credited with creating and popularizing the most familiar image that we have now of Santa as this chubby, jolly, grandfatherly figure in the red suit, introduced around the 1930s. But like any good idea, if it's out there, you may as well rip it off. And that's what the Coca-Cola company did from another beverage company, White Rock, from Whitestone, New York. And they actually were the first ones to come out with this advertising, Santa Claus, as you can see in this advertising here from 1915. So Christmas, as you can see, is a real conglomeration of a lot of traditions, a lot of ideas, a lot of customs and characters and theology, all shoved together under the tree. So, that's my talk. Thank you. Thank you again for coming on such a cold night. I appreciate it.